Welcome to Worldview Matters. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazo.
Hey guys, welcome. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you sharing the podcast, sharing the new show on social media. And another great guest today, guys. Talk about a great week. Trevor Loudon is with us today. He's got a brand new book out. It's called House Un-Americans. I've known a little bit about Trevor, his background. He's an author, speaker, filmmaker. We're also going to talk briefly about enemies within the church. Also, according to Wikipedia, he is a far-right conspiracy theorist. Like I said, his latest book, House Un-Americans. His other books include White House Reds. That's on my bookshelf. Also, Security Risk Senators. We're going to be talking about Wisconsin's Tammy Baldwin. I'm sure we're going to have to at least touch briefly on Kamala Harris. And I just want to welcome Trevor Loudon to Worldview Matters. How you doing, Trevor?
Great to see you, David. Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, great to see you, too. You're actually traveling. You couldn't get home today. You're at a hotel. Have you been speaking?
Yeah, I've been up in Pennsylvania area, North Carolina, just traveling through Georgia right now on the way home. But normally I'd be home by now, but we had some delays, and so this is from my hotel room studio. So the lighting isn't quite as good as normal, but I hope my messaging will compensate for that.
Yeah, that's the important thing, the content, and that's what's driving this, because there's so many things we need to talk about. You have been an expert on exposing radicals in our own government, in the U.S. government. Let's go back even further than when you started the series on congressmen, senators, and now the new one, Un-American, House Un-Americans. You're from New Zealand. Why did you become so interested with politics and the government of the United States?
Well, I think, I was just back in New Zealand. My dad's 90, and he was telling me during World War II, they were terrified of a Japanese invasion. Absolutely terrified. And if it wasn't for the sacrifice of your fathers and uncles and grandfathers who stopped the Japanese at the battles of Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea and Midway, I might not be here, folks. So everybody who loves freedom must admire the American Constitution, must be grateful to the contribution that America has made to saving people from tyranny, restoring freedom, and being a beacon to everybody who loves liberty. If America is lost, Western civilization is lost. It's gone. It'll be gone for 1,000 years. So I'm part of this is gratitude, but part of it is just acknowledging the fantastic role that the U.S. has played in the world, and the example of the U.S. Constitution. That's the blueprint for liberty, for people who love freedom.
Well, thank you, sir, for being a freedom fighter all these years. You just had to laugh, probably you chuckled when I mentioned what Wikipedia says about you.
Sure.
Well, what we've found in recent years, people or things that were called conspiracy theorists have become true. So I don't think that holds much weight anymore. But
no, it's a badge of honor, really.
Yeah, exactly. So are you mentioned at the Southern Poverty Law Center by any chance as a radical?
Apparently I'm a hater. I'm a hater. It's also mentioned by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a complete Marxist organization which has employed pro-North Korean activists. But this organization is quoted by the FBI and news media as some sort of objective force in American politics. It's a communist front. And of course they're going to denigrate people like me and you who stand against communism.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about how this applies to people that you say oftentimes they could not even pass a security check or background check, but yet they're elected representatives in the U.S. Congress and the United States Senate, and some have been elected president. You've had a lot to say because you've done extensive research on this topic, and it just shows the influence of communism and Marxism, and especially in your book, White House Reds, because two people I want to focus on today, Trevor Loudon, are Tammy Baldwin, because we're in Wisconsin here. That's what the show is based in, Appleton, Wisconsin, and Kamala Harris. But before we do that, touch on your latest series, which is House Un-Americans. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll go back to the individuals.
Well, last time I was in Appleton, I went to the grave of Joseph McCarthy, who is buried by the river there. And he was a hero because he pointed out the massive Soviet infiltration of the American government. But unfortunately, the communists came up with the phrase McCarthyism and ridiculed him, and cowards in his own Republican Party repudiated him, which basically allowed the communists to just take over the State Department and many other U.S. government departments, to the point that now we're really living in a semi-completed communist revolution. Look, I'm sure there's lots of people watching who've had to undergo background checks to serve in the military or a government position, and they can be very rigorous. But if you're a young Marxist radical like Mark Pocan or Tammy Baldwin or Gwen Moore in Milwaukee, and you get elected to Congress where you may serve on the Homeland Security Committee or the Armed Services Committee or even the Intelligence Committee, there are zero background checks, none whatsoever, because the people are supposed to vet the candidates and the media is supposed to help you do it. Well, what happens if the media's on the wrong side? You're in trouble. And so, the House Un-Americans is a series of 6 books profiling about 100 U.S. Congress members, and from Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff right down to the newest freshman, and basically detailing their extensive communist ties, their works with the Chinese, their links to the World Economic Forum and globalist elements, their links to Cuba, North Korea, and Iran, and local domestic communist movements. We've got 40% of the Congress and 40% of the Senate couldn't pass a background check to drive a school bus in any county in Wisconsin or any county in America. But they're running every. That's why we have open borders. That's why the military's been gutted. That's why Iran's about to get the nuclear bomb, because we have been so badly penetrated in our own Congress and Senate and the White House.
Well, let me ask you this. We love the phrase, elections have consequences, and every election does. There are consequences. For the average voter, how can they get information on these people if the media, they're certainly not, the campaign's all about issues that many of them, a lot of Americans don't even care about. So they're not going to dig into the background of the candidates. They're not going to do what maybe the media did 100 years ago, what the press did before the internet, and, before the sensationalism and all the lies and all the campaign tactics that I mean, yesterday, I just interviewed Heidi St. John out in Washington State. She ran for Congress out there, and she was talking about some tactics that they were pulling out there, which maybe in Washington State we shouldn't be surprised. But it's just sad that you've got to have a lot of money to not only get your truth and your campaign information out there, but you've got to defend a lot of the nonsense, the garbage, and the lies that are coming against you. How can the average American discern this, Trevor Loudon?
Well, that's why I'm not just trying to push my own barrow, but you can go to places like David Horowitz's websites, I would go to KeyWiki, which is my website, KEYWIKI. I've got 154,000 files on there of all your local congressmen and senators, and KeyWiki right down in the corner there, or my books. You can get. The White House Reds will tell you about the presidential candidates. Security Risk Senators details the senators, and House Un-Americans is all about the House. So they are the places I would start.
Okay.
But there are not a lot of people doing this, unfortunately.
That's right.
And my work is used by a lot of other people. But that's what my team does. We go through these people's underwear drawers. And we focus on their communist ties. A lot of people, a lot of congressmen will come under scrutiny for their voting record or for their shady business deals. But since the days of McCarthy, nobody looks at their communist ties. Well, I do that. David Horowitz does that. Breitbart does it to some degree. But really, I think I've done more of it than anyone else. So that's why I put the books out. I'm putting these books out in hard copy. Get them at trevorloudon.com. Hard copy that cannot be taken off the internet. They're out there. Thousands of copies are all over the country. You can pick them up and reference your local congressman and see who he's working with or she is working with. So there's no substitute for having it there in paper.
Yes.
You can't beat that.
Yeah, trevorlouden.com. By the way, we're going to take a break in a few minutes, but we're going to pick this up after the break, too, because we can't just spend 2 minutes and talk about Kamala Harris. Talk about ties to communist China. Tell us a little bit about her background and how, I don't know, I guess people didn't care. She just completely slipped under the radar and was able to be Joe Biden's vice president. Well,
that's right. See, you have a lot of Maoists in New Zealand, in America. And what these are people who started in the 1960s loving Chairman Mao and supporting the SDS, the League of Revolutionary Struggle, all these communist groups. And they all got behind Jesse Jackson in the 80s, and they backed him. And they come up with this idea of the Rainbow Coalition, where you get all the minorities together with the progressive whites and you get a majority. That's what elected Barack Obama. But it was also what elected Kamala Harris. I was saying 4 years ago she was going to be the vice president. She was going to be on the ticket in 2020. I was saying this way before she was even thought of, because I read the communist literature. Her parents were both Maoists. They were involved in the organization which became the Black Panther Party. She was nurtured by Maoist groups. She was nurtured by a man called Steve Phillips, who was a very rich man out of San Francisco, who was a student Maoist at Stanford University, but married into a $2 billion fortune and used that money to elect Kamala Harris to San Francisco attorney, DA, then California Attorney General, then US VP. He was also behind Barack Obama, also behind Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey, and also behind Stacey Abrams, who still thinks she's the governor of Georgia.
Yes.
So this Maoist cabal with a lot of money, working with the Soros groups and others, has been electing candidates of hard left, pro-Chinese candidates of color by using minority populations. And Kamala Harris is one of their key successors. But they engineered into that position. She was supposed to be the presidential candidate, but she was so terrible she had to drop out. Yeah. So they put Joe Biden in, and then they got Joe Biden to nominate her as his VP. It was planned. She is China. She has got links to Black Lives Matter, which is a Chinese operation. Her husband works for has got Chinese Communist Party members in his law firm. Everything about her leads back to China.
Yep, no surprise. And thank you for putting it out there plainly. And you have for many years. So thank you. We've got to know who these people are and now what they're about. So their actions shouldn't surprise us anymore when they back certain radical leftist efforts. But we've got to take a break. We are with Trevor Loudon. The brand new book is House Un-Americans. And we're going to come right back and talk with more. Trevor Loudon and trevorlouden.com is the website. We'll be back in a minute.
Today's show is brought to you by Harbinger's Daily. World news biblically understood. Stay informed at harbingersdaily.com.
We are back with author and filmmaker Trevor Loudon. And before we get into a senator with a lot of red around her, we're going to talk about a DVD that Trevor was a part of called Enemies Within the Church. I'm looking at the back cover. We've had Kerry Gordon on the podcast, E.W. Jackson. So, Trevor, tell us about Enemies Within the Church.
Yeah, well, I was brought into that project through my knowledge of Marxism. We were, look, I'd understood for a long time that the Marxists had been infiltrating the mainstream churches. The very first communist front in America was in 1907. It was the Methodist Federation for Social Action. Because the communists understood they could never take America from the outside. They would have to take her from the inside.
That's right.
And the churches are the backbone of this country. So they'd have to get into the churches. And by the 20s and 30s, they had deeply penetrated the Episcopalians, the Methodists. They began infiltrating the Catholics in the 30s. And so they had, by the 60s and the 70s, they pretty much had them under left-wing control. But they didn't have the evangelicals. They didn't have the Baptists. They didn't have the more traditional independent churches. So really, since the 70s, there's been a strong program to bring Marxism into the evangelical church, into the Baptists. You know, we hear the phrase woke, a woke church. A woke means it's what the Chinese communists used to call consciousness raising. We called it brainwashing. It is raising your consciousness of issues of gay oppression, of social injustice, of global warming, of refugee resettlement, of your white privilege, all Marxist talking points, but cloaked in Christian terminology. So the woke church is the Marxist church. It comes from the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It's the Maoist Marxist church. So enemies within the church was a way to address this, expose this, because millions of people go to church, say, for the first time. They just want to get more spiritually connected. So they go to this woke church and they don't hear anything about the Old Testament, or they don't hear anything about the Ten Commandments, but they do hear about their white privilege and the gay-friendly agenda, and they think this is genuine Christianity. They don't know the difference. So, and that's all through the Bible colleges. They're as bad as the secular universities now. So we had to put out the movie to warn people about this.
So Enemies Within is available in the shop at trevorloudon.com. I mean, obviously it was evil, but it was a brilliant strategy. As you said, the American church was the background of the nation. And if they could get into the churches and somehow subvert the churches, and starting with leaders and then congregations, which they have done. 2020, I couldn't believe how many professing Christians jumped on the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation bandwagon, and they were out there with the communist fist thinking they were fighting for a good cause under the guise of compassion or anti-racism.
That's right. Well, you know, communism is ultimately diabolical. And don't you think the devil would want to be inside God's church? Don't you think, with all its respectability, all its money, all its influence, that's where the devil would want to be? And if Christians aren't grounded enough, they can be infiltrated, and the infiltrators bring in more infiltrators, and they take over the Bible colleges and train the next generation of pastors. And in 30 years, you've gone from a Bible-believing church into a woke Marxist church. And all the new people don't know the difference, and the old people shut their mouths.
Yeah. So Trevor, we have to talk about Tammy Baldwin now, because the bulk of our audience, I believe, is in Wisconsin, because that's where we are based. Of course, we got viewers from across the country. Praise God for that. But I don't remember anyone talking about her background. I just knew a couple of the radical things about her and her socialist policies and everything like that. But and then of course she's a lesbian, and she's a radical leftist. But her ties to the Chinese Communist Party or those types of influences. Tell us more about that. What don't people know about Tammy Baldwin still?
Well, she got her start in the Maoist pro-Chinese Rainbow Coalition. That's where she came from. She was working with the Maoists. But see, in Madison, Wisconsin, Democratic Socialists of America, the biggest Marxist organization in the country now, they were very strong in Madison in the 80s, and they controlled most of the city council, most of the Dane County Commission. They had a lot of power in the city because of the university, because of the big university there, which has always been radical left. And so Tammy Baldwin worked her way up in local Dane County politics by basically playing hopscotch with all these Marxists. One of them would leave a job, she would take the job. Then somebody else would leave a job, she would take that job. All of her early positions were organized by Democratic Socialists of America, and she supported them and they supported her. But the really most dangerous connection is in Madison, there's a group called the Colombian Support Network. And that is a support network for the Maoist communist rebels in Colombia in South America. And so these rebels make their money selling, they call them narco-terrorists. They make their money selling cocaine to America's youth. That's their main source of revenue for the communist revolution. Now, this Colombian Support Network for nearly 40 years now has supported the Colombian rebels, communist rebels in Colombia, and they send delegations down there. They work on the local legislators like Russ Feingold to help these Colombian rebels. Tammy Baldwin and Mark Pocan have been members of this Colombian Support Network since at least the early 90s. They both, I think Mark Pocan served on the executive of this organization. I think Tammy Baldwin did too. But she went down to Colombia in one of their delegations. She met with some of these rebels down there. The current president of Colombia, who was an ex-Maoist rebel, she hosted him around the U.S. Congress a few years ago, introducing him to all of these, Democrat politicians. She worked in the U.S. Congress to try and get U.S. military aid cut off to the Colombian government, who were fighting the communists, so the communists would have an easier road to take over that country, which they pretty much have now. She played a major role in the U.S. Congress into bringing a communist government into power in Colombia, an American ally, and not just a communist government that makes its money selling cocaine to American children. So she is absolutely complicit with these people, has worked to enable these people, and used her position in the U.S. Congress to try and get U.S. military aid cut off to the Colombian soldiers who were fighting these Colombian terrorists. She is absolutely in bed with some of the worst terrorist elements on the planet. But she's a little hero in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
She's,
exactly.
Because nobody calls her out for this stuff.
No. Well, I remember...
This is not hard to find. This is publicly available knowledge.
Right. And I remember at the, I think it was 2010 when the leftists tried to recall Governor Scott Walker at the time.
Yes.
And they were busing in kids from schools, the public schools, with the teachers' unions and everything. There were literally, in Madison, Wisconsin, outside the Capitol, tables set up for the Socialist Party USA. And they were right out there in the open. There were, the communist fists and on all the posters calling Scott Walker Hitler. And it's very ironic, but they're not hiding it anymore. Trevor, it just seems like a lot of people either just aren't paying attention or they don't know where to get the information on these people. Yeah.
Well, as you said, what happened in Wisconsin was a communist operation to destroy Scott Walker. The same people went out and tried to destroy Trump. The same people now are still trying to destroy Trump or anybody else who succeeds him. So the communist revolution you saw in Madison is now nationwide. And Tammy Baldwin's a big part of that. But yeah, look, the FBI is working for the other side now. They used to monitor these people, but now they don't. They go after people who took selfies in the Capitol building, and they monitor conservative Catholics and people who don't like pornography in schools and people who like borders. That's the people the FBI are going after now. And so our intelligence services are useless. All the police intelligence services have been abolished or gutted. So you really have to go to people, the kind of books that I write. I'm not just pushing my own barrow, but my books, Security Risk Senators, White House Reds, House Un-Americans, give more detail on the communist backgrounds of your representatives than anything that has ever been written in this country. I'm not saying this to boast, I'm just stating a fact. And everybody has to know this information, because a lot of the time you're voting for people, you have no idea of their background, you're just trusting they've been vetted, but there are no background checks in Congress at all, zero. And so how it works is simple. The communists have taken over the unions, and the unions control most of the politicians.
Yep.
So they can determine who gets elected and who doesn't. That's how it works. That's how it works in Wisconsin. That's how you have the governor you have now. That's how you almost got Mandela Barnes and other communists, and that's why you don't have Scott Walker.
Wow, there's so much catching up to do, it seems. I don't know if we can ever get the nation back, but we're fighting. And I agree with you, Trevor. Your books are so extensive and detailed, and I appreciate your research. I encourage people to check out the shop at trevorloudon.com. To be continued, my friend. God bless you. Keep making trouble for the kingdom of God and raising awareness around the country, brother.
We're going to need divine providence to get us out of this, but we got to show the courage and faith to make that possible.
Yes.
That's our job.
Amen. Trevor, thank you so much for your time. God bless.
Thank you so much, David.
Guys, keep sharing the podcast and subscribing for those updates. Tomorrow we will have former transgender Laura Perry Smaltz on. We'll talk about what's going on in those government-run schools, and more great guests coming up next week. I'll tell you about those tomorrow. For now, God bless you, and as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter.